Okay, thank you very much, Hal. By the way, Chris is half of my middle name, which is Christian, so it's always very complex in my case. I'm delighted to share my research with you. This research has been financed by NHTSA as well as a dozen other partners over the years, transit agencies, state transit departments, and other groups. So I'm very pleased to present 5 areas that highlight some of our research, just almost the tip of the iceberg on the association between light rail transit, streetcars, bus rapid transit, and, oh, by the way, commuter rail transit. I forgot to add that, on rents, jobs, and people. This presentation will go about 40 minutes, give or take. I'll be timing myself. There may be occasions where I'll tell you that I need to speed up, but you will have access to the entire slideshow to go back and refer. Also, the slides are numbered, so in case you have any questions, you can note the question as per the slide so I can go back to it if I need to elaborate. So this slide I'm showing here now shows sort of from the year 1925, normalizing all of the mode trends. We see that automobile activity was the most, saw the largest increase up into the 1990s, with bus trailing off, rapid transit sort of staying level, and relative to population, you see here automobile use or registrations really zoomed ahead of population. And really all other forms of transit either kept pace with population change or in fact declined in the case of streetcar and light rail. But what's interesting is that when we normalize this to the year 2003, here we're seeing population growth, this line here. We're seeing growth in growth in the automobile use here. And here is fixed guideway transit use here. Now, whether these trends will continue beyond the year 2014, no one really knows, but no one really knows what's going to happen next year anyway, it seems. So I'm going to start with the rent question. To what extent do these fixed guideway systems influence the rents paid, or I should say the asking rents paid for office, retail, and apartments? But first we have the theory. The theory basically says, and I'm not going to read all of this, you can go back to it if you need to, but theory says that if we improve transportation accessibility by adding opportunities through rail and bus rapid transit and so forth, then we should improve agglomerations of economy, and that should result in more economic activity, especially that locating or concentrating around the fixed guideway investments. So that's the overall theory, and there's not much work on this area. Now, as background, we've looked at probably up to 30 different transit or fixed guideway transit lines. Here you see a sample of light rail systems around the country we looked at. We looked at 11 light rail systems, actually 12. Here are some of the bus rapid transit systems around the country. We looked at about 8 systems, and many of those have multiple lines, especially Pittsburgh has 3 different lines. Here we have streetcar systems around the country, Portland, Seattle, and Tampa. Especially like the fellow screaming all aboard on the right-hand side for Tampa. I need to go and ride that system one day. And then we have commuter rail. So in some cases, we're going to be presenting results for commuter rail that are really rather new and not reported anywhere else before. We have 5 commuter rail systems we're looking at, and these are just 3 of them. So the theory is on rents that as we invest in fixed guideway systems, certain parts of the real estate market, office, retail, apartments, may benefit more from proximity to the stations, or in this case, we're going to measure the corridor center lines. And so we need to test that proposition that will we see a revealed rent premium per square foot with respect to office, retail, and apartments, and also with respect to the 4 basic transit systems we're looking at. The hypothesis, of course, is that there's no significant effect between rents and proximity. And proximity, by the way, is measured binarily as within 1/2 mile of a transit corridor and between 1/2 mile and 1 mile of the transit corridor. We're not looking at stations, we're looking at corridors. And then are there differences in magnitudes between the closer and the second corridors? And you'll see what I mean momentarily. So we're going to be applying regression analysis to this. So it's going to be cross-section hedonic regression analysis. Our data come from CoStar, principally the commercial real estate data source. They've given us permission to use their data. The data are from early 2015. And by the way, for our study areas collectively, we have about 40,000 cases, and they represent about 3 billion square feet of total office space and another space. So we have a very large and robust data set, thanks very much to CoStar. So I'm not going to show you the full regression model and regression results. In fact, I'll be presenting those at TRB in a poster session next year. So drop by my poster session and you'll see the full model and the full presentation of the regression results. But here's the summary. We have bus rapid transit, light rail transit, half mile and 1/2 mile to 1 mile, streetcar transit, and commuter rail transit. So let's look at classes of activities first. For office activity, we don't find any statistically significant premium paid by office rents in either of the two half-mile corridors along BRT corridors. That's an interesting finding because later on we'll find that the BRT is actually quite good at attracting certain numbers of jobs within the corridors, but we'll get to that later. For light rail systems, what's interesting to us is that there is a positive premium in the 1/2 mile to 1 mile area. That's interesting because we would expect there would be a higher premium in the first half mile. But it turns out that most of our systems that we studied had their lines installed during the 80s and 90s, probably in the days when we didn't really pay attention to the benefits of right planning LRT systems or LRT lines. And so in many cases, LRT lines in Portland and Sacramento and San Diego and other places were put along corridors, transportation corridors, with very little opportunity for development right at the stations themselves. And so that's why there's not an effect here. For streetcar transit, very strong premiums, 5% in the first half mile, 3.9% on the next half mile. And for commuter rail transit, the story is you don't want to be anywhere near a commuter rail transit. These are industrial sites, they're freight trains, they're blighted areas for the most part, and we see the same effect for retail as well. So speaking about retail, we find a surprising effect that retail is actually negatively affected in the first half mile along near BRT stations. We suspect that BRT, because it's serving mostly existing commercial corridors, that there might be some effect here going on between the retail activity that might be lower grade along these corridors than maybe elsewhere. This needs more research by us. But look at the other two. So for office, we find a very sizable premium paid for being within a half mile and a mile of corridors for retail activities. And then very strong within the first half mile for streetcar and nothing after. Apartments, very interesting to us that the closer you are, the higher the premium. And the premium amount varies by system. All three systems here have positive effects. Streetcars have by far the largest positive effect. LRT, light rail, has the second largest effect, although considerably less effective, less sizable, and BRT has an effect as well. So these are findings we just came up with a couple of months ago. I'll be sharing these at TRB in my poster session. So I basically told you the findings. I'll just skip over this slide. And we'll move on to next. The next one is wages and transit. So the theory is, and I'm going to read this, despite wishful thinking that transit will expand the supply of lower wage jobs near transit stations, economic theory posits that transit will increase real estate values, requiring investors to increase returns, resulting in higher wage jobs, even to the extent of displacing lower wage ones. So our theory is, okay, maybe there's no statistically significant effect between the light rail corridor or the transit corridors and jobs by wages, but the alternative is that there may be. And we're going to be looking at wages. Here are the wage categories we're looking at. We're looking at the lower wage category, middle wage category, and upper wage category. Now we're using the LEHD database, and those of you who know it know that they have a wage category in there that really is pretty useless. What we do to establish the wage groupings, low, middle, and high, is we take BEA data and we organize the two-digit NAICS jobs by the wage categories, and we come up with a way to say, okay, 31% of all the jobs are these jobs, and we call them low wage because that's the median wage. Middle wage jobs, same, 35% of all jobs are middle wage jobs, and that's the wage level, and 34% of all the jobs are in the upper wage categories. So we do the best we can to differentiate the categories objectively, and I think we did a pretty good job. So the method we use is shift share over time. And we also look at shift share over time before the recession and during recession recovery, because we want to see if maybe the economic structure is changing such that certain kinds of jobs by wage have reoriented their attractiveness towards transit stations. Now actually we are using transit stations here, location within 1/2 mile of transit stations. Now, shift share analysis allows us to assign or attribute change in jobs, in this case, to regional shifts. If the metropolitan area changes by 10%, then all jobs should change by 10%. Industry shift, if 10% of if jobs in high tech increase by 10% in the industry, then all jobs in that sector should change by the same amount everywhere. We'll be looking at the station area shift. To what extent do changes occur within the station area itself, in a sense controlling for these two other factors. So we'll be reporting only the station area effect. So here's the result. So let's look at light rail. And this is the pre-recession. The dark is pre-recession dark. The nice green is recession recovery. Notice that for light rail, not much change really in the shift in the share of jobs in the lower and middle categories, but we'll look at the tremendous shift in upper wage jobs from declining pre-recession to expanding considerably in the recession recovery period. And overall, we see this change as well. This is a very strong, interesting outcome for the recession recovery period. The question we would have, of course, is whether this will be sustained over the next several years, and that will be the subject of ongoing research. For streetcars, something very different is happening. Lower wage jobs, certainly along streetcars before the recession, not much change in the share of jobs before the recession, but after the recession, the lower wage jobs really picked up, and so did the upper wage jobs. And the middle wage jobs picked up some, but these are the two really large changes. And so what we deduce is that if you're on the streetcar and you're going to your office, you have an upper wage, you get off the streetcar and you go to the deli or some store right at the station. And so we have a synergistic effect going on here between the lower wage jobs and the upper wage jobs. Not so much with the middle wage jobs. With an overall change, this is really remarkable, such a dramatic change from pre-recession to recession recovery for streetcars. And by the way, the three streetcar systems we're looking at were all in place almost the entire time during the study period. So there's not much there's not a temporal effect going on here, at least not much anyway. Bus rapid transit systems, a very interesting story. All four of these have very interesting stories. So for BRT, we see a very sizable increase in the lower wage jobs during recession recovery on top of a very small base. We see moderate increases in improvements in the middle wage jobs, actually a reversal of trends from the recession period. But then we see the upper wage jobs are still escaping, moving away from the BRT station areas. We don't know why, especially since some BRT stations are now in downtowns like Cleveland, and Kansas City is forthcoming, or they're already there, I should say. So this is an anomaly to us. We need to sort of take a closer look at this, probably looking at each individual BRT system on its own. Then for commuter rail, this is the overall loser. Nobody wants to work, it seems, near commuter rail systems. Well, maybe some increase in middle wage jobs, but really for the most part, continuing erosion of jobs around commuter rail systems. So I basically told you some of the key insights here. We want to take a harder look at some of the individual systems to see what might be going on to get more insights into design and planning and just local effects. So now we're going to turn to the change in share of jobs over time with respect to light rail, streetcar, bus rapid transit by distance band. Now, there's been a lot of talk about the quarter-mile radius and the half-mile radius, the half-mile distance from transit stations. And let me tell you a small story, at least as far as I can reconstruct it from the history. So back in the early 2000s, when I was asking the then planners for the Arlington, Virginia metro system, why they decided to put the 5 metro stations where they did through the heart of the county, and that gave me really good reasons. And then I said, well, why did you limit the development radius to just 1/4 of a mile? And they said that was the best information they had at the time. Back in the 1970s, the question came about what should be our planning area around these stations? Should it be a mile or half a mile or just what? So somebody somewhere said, well, we think that people are willing only to walk 10 minutes to go from a transit station to their destination or vice versa. Okay, then that's nice. So how far do they walk? What's the distance covered in 10 minutes? Well, no one really knew for sure, so somebody said, well, we know that a walk in the park runs about 2 miles an hour. Okay, 2 miles an hour gives you about a 1/4 mile walking distance. And there you are. That's how Arlington, Virginia established its 1/4 mile radius for planning. And almost all of the early transit systems, when they did their planning, used a 1/4 mile radius. And the most recent one that I understand is Houston. About 5 or 6 years ago, when it did its planning around light rail stations, it chose the 1/4 mile distance. But in the meantime, my student, Brian Canepa, then at Virginia Tech, studied all of the walking studies, and to cut his work short, or simply, he found that if you are walking with a purpose, we call that a business walk. You're going to get off the station and go to the office. That's a walk with a purpose. That's a business walk. You walk 3 miles an hour. You cover the greater part of a half mile. If you're in New York City, though, you walk 3.9 miles per hour. You cover the better part of a kilometer in that distance. So we're asking the question here, can we construct a schematic showing the change in jobs using using regression analysis over time to find out what the distance effects are? And here's what we found for light rail. So we found that there was a 0.8% change in jobs within a 1/8 mile distance of light rail transit stations in what we call transit counties. So we look at metropolitan areas, but we don't study all the counties in metropolitan areas. We study only those that have transit in them. So this was the first 1/8 mile effect. This is the next one. This is the difference, the next 1/8 mile effect in this case. This is the next 1/4 mile effect. This is the next 1/4 mile effect, and the next 1/4 mile, and the next 1/4 mile. And what you see here is a stair step. Now, it turns out that 75% of the change in jobs does, in fact, occur in the first 1/2 mile. That's sort of following our expectations. But these are not trivial changes. If you come out to 1.25 miles, you're adding another almost 25%, maybe 20% anyway. This is a very interesting relationship for planning purposes. So yes, you do want to make sure your planning areas in the first 1/2 mile try to attract the largest number of jobs, but don't ignore just a little farther away, because you're going to see some opportunities there as well, based on our study. For streetcar, we did the same kind of analysis. We found that 67% of the change occurred within the first 1/2 mile. But look, the next distance up to 1.25 miles, very substantial change, another 1/4 perhaps, and even out 1.25 miles or 1.5 miles. But this is where I would say would be a nice secondary planning area to look for in your planning. And then here's bus rapid transit, very strong effect in the first 1/8 mile, 75%. Another, small share in the next 1/8 mile out. But basically everything, all the influence of BRT occurs well within the first 1/2 mile and really well within the first 1/4 mile. Now, we published a study in the Journal of Public Transportation in 2012 or 11 or so. That was a case study of the Eugene, Oregon bus rapid transit system. And it was the first of its kind to look at the distance threshold effects. And we found that about 80%, actually more like 90% of the jobs were within the first 1/8 mile in the case of Eugene Springfield. Here, for all systems combined, it's the first 75% of the jobs occur within the first 1/8 mile. So this tells us a lot about how tightly around BRT stations the job market responds to bus rapid transit. So actually, I'm doing very well on time. I didn't realize I was going to do this well. Here we're going to look at change in share of jobs over time with respect to light rail, streetcar, and bus rapid transit systems. And we're looking at station distances. Now, this can be a little complex. And we're looking at the, I'm sorry, I need to finish up this. So finishing up what I just reviewed before, this effect, that effect, and so forth. I did talk with you mostly about this already. Light rail transit, strong effects, first 1/2 mile, but non-trivial effects, even out to 1.25 miles. Really the same for streetcar transit, but bus rapid transit, very tight around the first 1/8 mile, and a little further out, but that's basically as far out as you want to go, at least based on our analysis for bus rapid transit. So now we'll be looking at change in shares of jobs by economic sector after or during the recession and recovery period. This is sort of how the market then is reorganizing itself, restructuring itself in light of the Great Recession. The hypothesis, of course, is there's no statistically significant difference over time between 2008 and 2011. We again use shift share analysis, but we report only the station area effect. Our data are the LEHD database for 2008 and 2011. Actually, it's not through, it's just 2008, 2011. So here's the light rail effect. Now, you need to study this. Here's manufacturing, for example, industrial, retail, food. It turns out that overall, for all of these sectors, and we divided up the 20 NAICS two-digit sectors into these eight larger sectors. It turns out in the case of light rail that there are large overall gains up to 1 mile away from transit stations. That's what this color is, or this shade. But look here. I'm going to get back to this later on, next set of slides. There's actually a job loss in light rail systems on the whole between 1/8 mile to 1/4 mile. Now I'm going to jump the gun a little bit and say we think there's a residential effect going on here. That is to say that in the 1/8 mile to 1/4 mile distance, we might be finding some residential activity occurring along or near light rail stations. So very strong upward effects in the 1/8 mile, and then jump over the next band, and you're seeing large gains as well in the other two bands. Largest share of change in healthcare, except for that odd 1/8 mile, 1/4 mile band. Sizable increases in education, again accepting that's 1/8 mile, 1/4 mile band, although it's very small. Office, now this is surprising to us. Office actually saw a reduction in jobs in the closest band, but increasing jobs further out. We don't exactly know why. It may be that some medical jobs, once a light rail station is put in place, and we know from other literature that medical centers are maybe the most sensitive to transit accessibility. You can imagine why. It may be that healthcare firms are outbidding office firms for that first closest location and forcing the office firms then to leapfrog over to the next bands. These other sectors have very weak results. Manufacturing is surprisingly high, but only at some distances from the light rail stations themselves. So that's light rail. These are very complex, and I encourage you to study these after the show on your own. Streetcar effects, really bifurcated. Office, and that's just about it. Office is dominating the change, and office is dominating the change in 1/4 mile to 1/2 mile band. The closer two bands are losing. And we think the reason is, and I'll show that to you in the next set of slides, the reason is that we think the market is having residential development outbid offices for the closest locations for all three of the streetcar systems we looked at. Small changes in the other categories. Overall, these changes basically reflect these changes here. Bus rapid transit.
Chris?
Yes. Yes.
This is how, usually I don't interrupt for questions, but I think this might help some in the audience. I had a question that came in regarding your definitions of the different types of transit. Can you explain how you define the types of transit, and especially the difference between streetcar and light rail?
Good question. So, light rail, there's heavy rail transit. We didn't study that. Heavy rail is designed to haul the largest amount of people over the longest distances at the greatest speeds. New York, Washington, D.C., and so forth. Light rail is sort of heavy rail light. It has 2 to 4 cars, usually, sometimes more than 4, but usually 2 to 4 cars. They're large cars. Not as large as heavy rail cars, but still pretty large. And the tracks are designed to take considerable loads, and they will haul the second largest number of people at the second fastest speeds among all the technologies. Now, streetcar, you may look at streetcar and it kind of looks like a light rail. And I actually wouldn't be surprised if some light rail cars aren't even called streetcars. But streetcars are slow. They serve very short distances. They only, I've never seen a streetcar with more than 2 cars, oftentimes just 1 car, whereas light rail will have up to 4. And so they're designed for serving close-in areas at slow speeds at relatively low volumes of passengers. Now, they may have more frequent service, so overall they might actually serve more people, but they're slow. And moreover, many streetcar systems don't even have signalized intersection priorities. Here in Tucson, for example, I use the streetcar here all the time. You go up to the street light, and if it's red, you have to wait till it turns green. And the streetcar lines themselves are actually in the regular travel lanes in many cities, including Portland and Tucson. Where light rail, except for the very downtown locations, light rail tends to be in its own dedicated lanes. Bus rapid transit we need to talk about that too for a minute or two. BRT is regular bus stops at all the intersections. They stop at 1/4 mile, 1/2 mile distances. You can just imagine the conventional bus service that we're all familiar with. Bus rapid transit is typically a differently designed bus. It has level loading specially designed platforms for ease of loading. The platforms are themselves stations, and the stations will show the times of the next BRT coming. You'll pay your fare at the station, not on the bus. The bus will have dedicated lanes, usually, and the bus will have a signalized priority in intersections. So you get through the intersection faster, and your stops are 1/2 mile or 1 mile between these stations. So they're kind of like light rail transit, or maybe kind of like streetcar, except they have dedicated lanes. So I hope that helps. I mean, that was a good question. I should have talked about that earlier.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Thanks for the clarification.
So here we see the streetcar. Go back here to the BRT effect. Again, by sector, very large effect on offices for BRT, and with a very, very large effect for offices in that first 1/8 mile. As I showed you in the earlier sets of slides, very small effects across most of the other sectors, some effect with education, and healthcare is also in that mix as well. And here's the overall results, with losses at the far distances away from these stations. Now, in our work for Eugene Springfield, we were thinking that, and we saw this effect too, we were thinking that with the presence of BRT, some firms decided to relocate from farther away to closer in, and essentially vacating sites a little farther away. We'd like to take a better look, a harder look at the other individual BRT systems that we have data for to confirm this. So we think that there are some very interesting things going on. And I'm going to have you read this, read our implications on your own. But I'm going to point out a caveat. We did another study that's not reported here, focusing only on manufacturing and using a large database and using a regression analysis across the country. And what we found, this was done by Joanna Ganning and her colleagues when she was at the University of Utah. What she found was that BRT stations actually attracted manufacturing. And we scratched our heads and scratched our heads. That can't be possible. Manufacturing is this, you make cars and airplanes. And what are they doing in downtowns around BRT stations? Well, it turns out that manufacturing has the largest number of economic sectors. And some of those, for example, include microbreweries, which can be done in basements and garages. And so we looked, casually at some of the microbrewery locations, especially in downtown Cleveland that has the Health Line and so forth. And we found a large number of microbreweries, either within or next to restaurants. And okay, now we get it. People can take the BRT in downtowns and many of these metropolitan areas, have their brew, and don't have to worry so much about driving home. Well, maybe they have to eventually. But that's just one of those things we are uncovering with our data set. So let me go on to the last set of slides dealing with demographic and housing change. So the idea is that if these investments attract jobs, maybe they'll attract other kinds of activity as well. So to what extent will households be attracted to these rail stations or corridors? To what extent will younger households be attracted to or repelled from or by these stations? And what about the housing changes? You know, the hypothesis would be there's no change, and here we have 8 different categories we're looking at, or I should say 9. I'm only going to report 2 or 3 of them here for you today. Oops. And the data come from the decennial census for 2000 to 2010. We will be looking at the 2015 ACS in our next updates for this. So here's what we're finding for light rail stations. We're finding that by age population, we're using a shift share analysis. We're finding that we're using a proportionate share analysis, not shift share. We're finding that the change between 2000 and 2010 within 1/8 mile of light rail stations distributed itself as we see here, under 35, 35 to 64, very small change in those over 65. And I think I misspoke earlier. I meant what I had said earlier about light rail is that these people were moving into the next band over. Well, they're not. I'll show you what I meant a little later on. I mixed up my slides. Very little effect on the next band over. Sizable effects on the next 2 bands over. So what's interesting for planning is that we're going to see that there's a fair amount of residential attractiveness to being very close, as there is also a fair amount of attractiveness to jobs. So in that first 1/8 mile, we're finding competition between the firms and the people who want to live near those light rail stations. So this causes me to think we need to consider much higher density or much better mixes of land uses in that first 1/8 mile area, maybe than what we're doing now. And the residential owner-renter, sort of as we'd expect, more renters than owners, but a sizable number, about 1/3 of the change, were owners themselves. So let's look at streetcar. Now streetcar, remember that I showed that streetcar was attracting jobs out here. And the reason is residential is being attracted to the areas closest to streetcars. And I think what's happening is something subtle. We need to look at this more carefully. Existing firms and existing buildings are going to stay put. But when you have a building that's torn down or a parking lot that is built into something else, chances are that parking lot or the redevelopment is into residential. So the jobs stay put in existing buildings, but the new buildings become residential by and large, not entirely, but by and large. And look at the split between owner and renter, about 50-50 in the case of streetcars in that first 1/8 mile. Very little effect beyond that first 1/8 mile. That's much more in contrast with light rail. And then BRT, bus rapid transit, very weak nominal effects in that first 1/8 mile. Now remember, that first 1/8 mile, we saw a lot of job change take place. So it's as though jobs are outbidding residential to be right at that first 1/8 mile. But remember, after that 1/8 mile to 1/4 mile, the job pressure is relieved, but still we see not a lot of increase in population beyond that 1/8 mile. We have to get to a mile, we have to get to 3/4 of a mile to see some change going on at all. And the same with owner-renter. So we don't see BRT attracting a lot of residential, but we do see BRT attracting a lot of jobs closest to the stations themselves. And I just talked about the implications here. Next steps, our data only go through 2011 using LEHD and the year 2000 using the census. We want to go up to the year 2015 in both cases. Update our study. We need to get some more resources for that, but our models are down, our templates are in place, so it would be a fairly simple matter to simply populate the updated cells and then see what's going on over time and many years after the recession actually stopped. We also want to drill down into station area or small area analysis to see what's happening around immediate station areas in terms of land uses, jobs, housing, and even rents. So there's a lot of things we can still do with this, but we have a good platform on which to base our next steps for analysis. Thank you very much, and let's have questions.
Thanks, Chris. As always, I'm so impressed at how much information you pack into your research and your presentations. We do have a number of questions, and we do have time to answer additional questions. So if you have any additional questions as we go through the Q&A, please feel free to enter that into your question, the question pane. So the first question that I have for you, Chris, is a multi-part question. So given the limitations of the data set, is it possible that any variations across modes, so for example, BRT versus LRT, say, are more a function of specific circumstances around the particular examples rather than impacts deriving from the mode?
Absolutely, it's possible. I don't think so. My hunch is that these systems have different market effects. Mm-hmm. The market effects for BRT are different from streetcar and are different from light rail. If you put BRT in downtown, as Kansas City did, as Cleveland has done, if there were no effects, then we would say that BRT effects in downtown Cleveland would be the same as streetcar effects in downtown Portland. They're not. BRT effects in Cleveland are important and they're impressive, but they're nothing like the streetcar effects that we see in Tampa or Portland. And light rail transit also has different effects. So, but that's a really good question, because I think we have the data, and once we do the updates, we'll certainly have current data to take a really hard look at comparing the differential effects of different modes on different spaces, the downtowns or the adjacent to downtowns or suburban centers or suburban corridors. And we have the data, we have the tools to do a differential analysis on individual systems. And in some cases, we actually have the data, I think, hedge my bet here, to look at within the same metropolitan area that has multiple modes. Are there differences? For example, Metropolitan Salt Lake City has, they have light rail, streetcar, commuter rail, and bus rapid transit. We could study Salt Lake City metropolitan area in more depth and look and come up with differential effects between modes. Good question. I think we can do that. I'd like to do that for the next go-around, actually. Thank you.
Okay, and then this also relates to that question. What about the time period of the data set? If we're looking at the period of the last decade or so, of course residential is outbidding office and retail pretty much everywhere. So cross-sector conclusions may be hard to draw?
Yeah, that's a good observation. I totally agree with it. What I'd like to know is, our data, we used a lot of LDHD data from 2002 through 2011, and our census data was only to 2010. If we can update to 2015 in all respects and do it spatially and lay it on our databases for these fixed guideway systems, we could detect even year-by-year changes in market attractiveness to rail stations by type of system and even by metropolitan area. I think there was a time, maybe because of the economy, especially because millennials were locked out of buying homes, that the market shifted towards closer in locations, towards rail accessible locations and so forth. But as millennials grow up and as they tend now to finally get some jobs, what do they do? Do they still stay closer in? The odds are they probably don't, but some do, and we don't know what that number is yet. This is a really interesting area to look at, especially with the updated information that we might be able to get. It's a great question. I don't have a definitive answer. I have my own hunches, though.
Okay. Great. So a question related to the rent premium. You show the changes of rent premium for different uses. My question is what you compared to, the average rent in each region or something else?
Yeah, this was a regression analysis, so we're looking at differences in means, the mean rent for the study area. So the study area would be actually all of the 40,000 cases would be the study collectively the study area for our analysis. So we're looking at the difference in the mean rents asked by location, controlling for the type of mode, controlling for the transit county it's located in, and controlling for distance 1/2 mile up to 1 mile, with all the other distances then being the referent case. So it's a first step analysis. We can do a lot more with this. I have actually done a study that was published in Transportation Research Record last year, I think, looking at office rents in metropolitan Dallas, Texas, where we were able to add in socioeconomic factors, some urban form factors, and other factors, and got a pretty good R-square, but basically found the same thing. And one more thing, in the case of Dallas, Texas, we had continuous distance measures to rail stations from office buildings. So my next step with this analysis here is to add socioeconomic data and then create continuous distances from each of the 40,000 parcels to the nearest rail station, not just the corridors, and then do maybe metropolitan area by metropolitan area analysis to see what's going on in metropolitan areas. The nice thing about CoStar is that for most metropolitan areas, they give us metropolitan area submarkets, which also allows a much greater opportunity for controlling market effects. So I'm looking forward to expanding on this study. This is the first of its kind that you're seeing here in terms of looking at all these modes and these three major land uses. But there's a lot more we can do with this, and a lot more I'd like to do with this.
Okay, great. So for the rent premiums, why did you look at transit corridors rather than just the station areas?
I have to hire staff, and we spent a lot of money, lost a lot of money, being unable, and I don't know, I'm not technical at this, my staff was not able to efficiently measure all 40,000 cases from where they were to the nearest station, wherever that was, across the 20+ metropolitan areas. So we decided, okay, we can do a corridor analysis using simple buffers, and that got the job done. So, you know, we're always hampered with budget limitations, but now we know what the data are. Now we know exactly what the challenges are. And so if we have an opportunity to get some resources, we know exactly then how to upgrade this to continuous distance to stations, and then, as I said earlier, add in the socioeconomic data, add in other market factor data, and so forth. But one thing we need to keep in mind, yes, we will improve the explanatory power of the model itself. We are very, very unlikely to change the direction of associations or even the magnitudes that you see here, because our database is so large, 40,000 cases, that it is picking up what it's designed to pick up, the variation against the mean with respect to distance from these stations and modes. But nonetheless, there's a lot more we can do, and I want to do it.
Okay, so Chris, you had mentioned more socioeconomic data. Can you just clarify what was, and maybe your study didn't examine this, but what was the change in residency within the corridors by race and ethnicity? And
well, we don't
what
know
was
that. Yeah.
Okay, and then was there an increase okay, so you don't know that. So I think this question is interested in perhaps delving into that, as well as looking at any increases or decreases in comparing white and minority populations. So that maybe that's something to consider.
No, I missed. I conflated the question with the rent analysis. We did, yes,
You
we
did.
did take a
Okay.
look. Yeah, in one of the studies we published on the NITSE website, we have two reports there. One called "Do TODs Make a Difference?" and the other called something like "National Study of BRT Development Outcomes." In the TOD study, if not even in both studies, we do show the demographic change around stations within the half-mile radius. And I don't have the studies right in front of me now. They're available online. Go to NITSE. But my recollection is that we were kind of surprised by the lack of change in socioeconomic changes. There were some. I think the younger population tended to be attracted to some stations, as did the older population. I think that the white population was a little more attracted to stations than the non-white population. I don't recall, but I don't think there was much of an income effect. We were actually very interested in sort of showing the world how society can be changed by investing in these systems and the kinds of people who would be locating near them. It turns out that there wasn't a whole lot going on. However, our data were limited between 2000 and 2010. 2010 was not a good year for analyzing a lot of things because the population movements did not change much between 2008 and 2010. Many of our systems didn't actually take effect until the mid-2000s, especially the BRT systems. And so I'm anxious to get the 2015 ACS data to the census tract level and update our analysis on the demographic and socioeconomic side to see if we are now uncovering or now seeing the kinds of changes that we would normally see take place. We just didn't see that in the first round of studies.
Okay. So do you think upper wage jobs decline near BRT stations because planners would opt for LRT in their showcase urban areas instead? And getting BRT is a sign that planners have decided your area isn't going to be fancy?
That question is unanswerable, but let me take another pass at it.
Okay.
I don't know that it's planners just doing what they're doing because they think they're going to do something in a certain way. BRT investments are very conscious investments. Eugene Springfield, 10, 15 years ago, looked at light rail and BRT, and they really wanted light rail. And asked the people there in Eugene Springfield about that. But when they took a hard look at the cost to build and maintain and the markets being served, they realized that BRT was the most cost-effective. And so it's not choosing between light rail because it's more glamorous or BRT because it might be less glamorous. It is a very conscious economic choice. In the case of Eugene Springfield. Now, in the case of Phoenix metropolitan area, they have a light rail system, but they didn't have enough money, don't have enough money to extend it all the places they want to. Well, who does? But they wanted to improve accessibility to other parts of the metropolitan area with something other than LRT because they couldn't afford LRT everywhere. So they chose BRT. The same in Los Angeles. And so what you're finding is probably the case where BRT is chosen because maybe LRT is preferred, but BRT is more affordable. Now, also, BRT tends to go into already existing, oftentimes stagnant economies. Kansas City, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Eugene Springfield, it's not all that booming, especially during the 2000s. And so a lot of these BRT systems are put in areas that are not economically booming. And so there's a lot of things going on with BRT, and that's another reason why we need to pay close attention to studying the differences between these systems, because they serve different needs and they serve different economies.
And that's a great point, Chris, and thanks for sharing that, because I think there's more behind the data, and some of that anecdotal information is really important for everybody to learn from. So I think we only have time for one more question, and then the rest will just have to be answered offline. So are there different types of development clustered around certain transit stops? For example, do you see residential growth at the ends of BRT routes and commercial growth in between? Are there similar patterns with the different kinds of transit?
Let's keep that question as our question for our next research.
Okay.
We actually have the data, and because we have the template, we can actually update the data and update the template. That's a killer question, and we can answer it. My sense, I don't even have a sense right now. That's such a good question. We need to frame our future research around it.
Okay, well, with that, this concludes our webinar, and thank you for joining us today, and thanks again, Chris, for sharing your great work with us and everybody out there. Yeah, and so you can view our other professional development offerings on our website at www.nitse.us. This concludes our webinar, and hopefully you'll enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks, everyone.